Good evening, good night to those of you watching across the pond. Welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio with use Adrian Calamel, who teaches history and terrorism at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And of course, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor in chief of the Washington Outsider. And tonight we are here to discuss how sports ties into global politics and geopolitical rivalry, particularly in the Gulf, with a focus on the drama and intrigue surrounding the recently completed takeover of the Newcastle club uh, by the PIF and PCP, the consortium that's largely led by Saudi Arabia, but administered by British companies. And Adrian is actually originally from Newcastle. And so before we delve into why what appears to be a simple sports business deal turned into this geopolitical kerfuffle, he will explain where Newcastle is exactly, why it's important for the participating parties, and what the club means to the people who are directly affected by these events.
Thanks for, excuse me. Thanks for having me, Arena. Yes, you may not be able to tell from my accent that I am half Geordie, half English, and people from Newcastle have that Geordie accent that you probably can't understand if you're from London. But in any event, my family's from there. My father is from South Shields, which was people watching this across the pond will know where that is. I grew up a lifelong Newcastle supporter, and the last 14 years, Newcastle is a city. It is similar to, you mentioned in my introduction, it's similar to many ways to a city like Buffalo, for people listening and watching on this in the United States. I would say kind of a Rust Belt type of city that is kind of the salt of the earth type people, friendly, friendly people, very welcoming. And if you look at the region, if you look at Newcastle, it really has been the northernmost frontier of England for the longest time since going back to the Roman area, going back to the building of Hadrian's Wall, which is right within a few kilometers of Newcastle. So Newcastle just has this unbelievable history behind it, and then it has this historic football club as well that was founded in 1892. St. James's Park, built in 1892. It's expanded to its current capacity, and it's seen its successes. It's seen its failures. We haven't had any success at the domestic level for quite some time. Uh, but there was, I would say, under the last 14 years, under the Mike Ashley ownership, there it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult for supporters. And I will say that for Mike Ashley, I will give him credit where credit is due. He was able to remove and get Newcastle out of debt, which Newcastle was in, and a lot of premier clubs find themselves in debt and currently in debt. So he was able to do that. But beyond that, he hasn't followed through on a single promise. So when Amanda Stavely showed up at a Newcastle game, sitting in the owner's box with Mike Ashley and with her connections with Manchester City and that whole deal that went through in 2008, it went live on social media and people were starting to wonder. And there had been rumors that Mike Ashley was looking to sell, but it all of a sudden kicked off this whole rumor mill that started, and it eventually materialized into a deal in 2020. But as we will discuss, there have been many stumbling blocks along the way.
Indeed.
And those stumbling blocks, yes, go ahead, Irina.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's been a very long journey from 2020 until recently. The Premier League decision to finally let the deal go through was probably one of the longest, if not the longest, such review in recent memory for
Oh,
sure.
oh, absolutely. And the whole thing, it fell outside the ODT, the owners directors test. It was not, it decided, it turned from what was to look at whether a club is financially fit, whether they can run a club, be successful in the Premier League. They're not using it as a private piggy bank, so to speak, if they can, but to make sure that they are able to run it, and then if they don't go into debt, they can own that club. There's also to look at to make sure that they haven't been involved in anything such as match fixing. There's been incidents where Juventus, one of the largest clubs, the old lady in Italy, was pushed down to the second division because of match fixing. All right, so that does happen, and it happened not just probably about 10 years back. It happened. So looking at Newcastle and looking at the deal, there were a number of issues with the Saudis coming in and the Saudi consortium. And it was, well, obviously the financial situation is there. It had 80% buy in from PIF, and PIF also is one of England's largest trading partners. So the English Premier League that runs as a business should be doing, if it's good enough for the English government, why isn't it good enough for the English Premier League? Number one. Number two, when you look at that that group, you have Amanda Stavely that owns at least 10% of the club. You have the Reuben brothers that also own 10% of the club. They haven't been involved in any of these other type of things that would normally impede some type of deal going through. The longest, I think Southampton has probably the longest streak for this being carried out, this process. But the ODT, this test, and then it not being, and it just stalled. But I would say that Manchester City, that took, I think it was something like 21 days for that deal to go through. And when this deal went in, everybody thought, okay, well, this is going to go through no problem. And that was my expectation. And then after that, everything that followed, when this news came across that the deal actually went through, I was shocked. I needed to pinch myself because I didn't think that the powers that be, whether it was the English Premier League, whether it was Qatar, whether it was you name it, would let this happen.
So the whole situation has been ridiculous. The Premier League initially appeared to be willing to let the deal go through. All of a sudden, Gary Hoffman, who recently resigned, came on board. Premier League started slowing down the process. Then they started claiming that they need to figure out whether or not PIF is affiliated with the Saudi Arabian government sufficiently for the Saudi government to be considered the director of the club in the event that the deal went through. Then they started making absurd demands. They wanted the members of the royal family to somehow join the actual leadership of the consortium, which did not make sense if they were so concerned about Saudis being at the helm as directors and that being against the rules of the Premier League. Then why would they want the royal family to be involved in this in any way? Lots of things happened. Eventually, all of this was challenged. There were a couple of legal challenges. One was anti-competition challenge. Premier League was essentially treating this particular deal differently from other deals of that sort. There were allegations, very credible allegations of collective lobbying by by the six top clubs and by a Qatar-backed broadcasting company that was making unrelated legal issues with Saudis over alleged piracy allegations, and they were somehow involved in this um, for who knows what reason. They were they were all sorts of campaigns were going on against everyone in any way involved in this issue, including local local activists and sponsors of the anti-competition bid. They were threatened. They were they were um, they were attacked by trolls on social media. Eventually, the British media got involved in the coverage, and um, all of a sudden, the Premier League dropped its anti-competition. Dropped its challenge. It agreed to the anti-competition um, bid being dropped in exchange for approving the deal, and that happened before the Qatari company being settled its piracy claims with the Saudis, and at the same time, this basically rendered the legal challenge brought by the Premier League, whether or not the ODT test was applicable, and whether or not PIF was a functionary of the Saudi government. Nullified that whole legal process. The deal appeared to have gone through. The new owners took over. Everything seemed to be going well, but uh, the six top clubs were not happy. They Premier League organized a meeting of 19 clubs. Newcastle was excluded from that meeting supposedly because its presence would make it awkward for everyone. I don't even know what that means. Premier League was questioned as to why they allowed the deal to go through. And let's remember that Manchester City deal was backed by the UAE government, so this was not the first time a foreign government owned the club. We all also know that externally Qatar owns Paris Saint Germain. Um, there were other Saudi deals going through, including with some of the football affiliates who were clamoring the most. They've had investments and requests for investments from PIF. We know that Saudi Arabia was investing in other areas of UK. There was no noise about any of that. It turned out that Qatar had a bid for Newcastle before the Saudis. They had an interest which was rebuffed, and their interest was not as much in the club as in the real estate in the area, which they would be using as their personal piggy bank in the event um, things did not work out back home with their own economic situation. They borrow heavily from the government. They don't have to repay those loans unless the need arises to return that money back home. So this was their way. Purchasing the land in Newcastle and real estate would have been their way of ensuring that they could keep some of their money outside Qatar. So that basically sets up this geopolitical, economic rivalry between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But Qatar never challenged the Saudi bid officially. Instead, various trolls affiliated with them started doing these attacks. And so that brings us to recent moments. Premier League continued with its challenges, its right to block sponsorships for Newcastle, and most recently, Gary Hoffman resigned over pressure related to why he allowed this bid to go through. And we saw that there were other difficulties. We saw that the new owners of Newcastle tried to get new managing directors, new uh, various new managers for the club, and they had some issues retaining people. Some of them appeared to have agreed to be purchased, and then so, all of a sudden withdrew from the bid. And Adrian, I remember you mentioning that you thought that this was not a coincidence, considering the context of what was going on. And Kaufman's resignation comes in light of not because of his alleged corruption, but because of the pressure from the clubs and others over him allowing the deal to go through. Can you explain what's going on here? Why is there this continuous post factum aggravation by all these entities?
Yeah. Excuse me, Arena. You brought up a lot of good points, and I will try to break them down. I'll start off with Gary Hoffman first of all. Uh, I don't want to. I don't want to say I feel bad for him. I'm glad to see the side of him, but he got pushed aside. He got pressured aside by the big six clubs. I don't think there's any other way of really looking at that, and that shows you how much sway they have on the league. And that goes back to the original point that you brought up about anti-competition laws. this is starting to look like a league. I talked about match fixing. This is like almost like trying to fix a league so it's rigged so that these top six clubs, and this goes into the super club debate if we even want to go in that direction, that was going to even give them more of a competitive advantage within the English league. It was going to kill off the chances of other clubs such as Newcastle playing in Europe. All right, so there's a whole bunch of issues. Gary Hoffman was brought in. The original bid was put in under Richard Masters, and what he basically did was he just strolled this thing along. And they said they had solved the piracy issues, and then after the piracy issues, then you saw all these issues start to come up with the Qatari run funded Khashoggi campaign to put the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia basically on a trial, um, a human rights trial by press and by tabloid magazine and by trolls that you brought up. So there's the anti-corruption part. There's the Qatar, you brought up the piracy. That was taken care of. That was settled. There have been agreements between Qatar and Saudi Arabia to have settled that spat. Uh, you mentioned that Qatar had interest in buying Newcastle, but it was self-serving. All right, and we're going to be kind of looking at north of the border after that. Hopefully, at the end of our discussion, looking at Scotland.
Mhm.
It was self-serving. It was about controlling real estate and using it as a financial piggy bank for themselves. Where I look at the intentions of what PIF is trying to do, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to diversify their holdings, and they're trying to not just diversify it, but they see an area where there is possibility, very great, uh, enormous potential to not just grow the club, but to grow the city, make it a tourist destination. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Scotland, or you can go up to get up to Edinburgh in no amount of time. Uh, so what they have planned and the amount of reinvestment and the amount of jobs that it's going to produce for Newcastle, I just look at the intentions of PIF, and I look at what Amanda Stately has said publicly. Uh, it just it looks like a perfect marriage, and why people would want to get in the way of this is completely it's greedy, it's self-interest, it's about maintaining control. And I'll point the clubs out. You have Manchester United, and I will say that Manchester City did sit on the sidelines for that group of they did not vote with that 19 club meeting, but you have them, you have Spurs, you have Arsenal. Who am I missing here? Um, um, City, Spurs, Arsenal, uh, uh, Chelsea, and finally the other one will come to me. But they've got a stranglehold on the league and the way it runs. So clubs that have seen recent success, like Leicester City, they're not considered part of the Big Six. They're not included into that group, into that exclusive network. And then there's also, you'll see floated out into the tabloids right now that part of this 19 club meeting was that the lower clubs, the Norwich cities, the Burnleys, the ones that are at the bottom of the table, are worried about being relegated. Well, they should be worried about being relegated, and quite frankly. And that's a problem that a lot of these clubs, such as the Norwich, that just bounced up to the Premier League and then bounce right back down, is that to stay in the Premier League, it is very tough that first year. It is very difficult. And you'll see that within 2, 3 years, a lot of teams that get promoted up into the Premier League cannot compete financially, and they end up getting dropped down. All right. And then finally, I'll touch on the managerial position. Eddie Howe, I don't have anything against him. And after watching Saturday's match against Brighton, or no, it was against um, oh my gosh, it's completely blanking on me. Um, watching the match on against Brentford. I'm sorry, watching the match on Saturday, you could see that Eddie Howe has had a real impact on the team, and it's been a real positive impact. We have been a very negative football team in our approach and our play. And Newcastle, the people of Newcastle, they like to be entertained. One of our periods when we were had some great teams was through the mid '90s, and they were known as the Entertainers. And Eddie Howe, uh, every time there was a play over this weekend where there was we were threatening on goal, there was at least 2 3 people in the box trying to make a play on the ball, and it ended up in being a 3-3 thriller that we should have actually won. um, with that being said, he is it's exciting. Will that keep us up? I hope so. I do think that during the January transfer window, he's going to bring some reinforcements in areas that we are lacking. But his position is not the first person that they approached. They approached the person from Dortmund, Borussia Dortmund. They approached Rafa Benitez, who is there, who would have stayed on had this deal gone through, who would have, if this deal had gone through during the summer, he would have signed with Newcastle instead of Everton. Newcastle did reach out to Brendan Rodgers. They were willing to buy out his contract there, but Brendan Rodgers said that he was willing to stay at Leicester City and wanted to stay there. And I can understand that. And personally, I'm not a Brendan Rodgers fan. And there just seems to be a whole lot of factors that were going into, okay, well, we're gonna put in Eddie Howe, and not saying anything against him, but he's not the marquee signing that they were looking for. It will be interesting to see what happens in the January transfer window. Whether Newcastle is completely blocked, I would suspect that there will be some clubs in England that won't want to get rid of players, that want to get rid of players, but will not sell to Newcastle. While there are other clubs that will probably be in that middle tier that will sell to Newcastle, and Newcastle will buy. I think Newcastle's probably going to have to look to the continent to bring in a lot of players during the transfer window and what they decide to do. I hope that
You know,
answers most of your questions there.
so what you're describing to me sounds nothing like short of a boycott campaign.
It is.
And
It is.
and
It's
to me,
yeah.
it's a mystery because in January 2021, this year, Saudi Arabia and Qatar signed the Alula agreement, which essentially was supposed to put all the worst of their political differences aside and focus on building a relationship. But it seems to me that nothing has been solved. Now, the Saudis have been reluctant to even mention Qatar's name with relations to all these campaigns and behind the scenes intrigue, whereas Qatar has appears to have no problem in funding these campaigns and backing all these entities and players and colluding with other local interests against Newcastle. Now, how do you explain that? And you wrote an excellent paper related to the context of the relations between these two countries and these human rights campaigns that became sort of a political football, especially given Qatar's own role in corruption related to both football specifically and its own human rights record. And we'll get to the football part a bit later, but it's got a record of its own that's far from unblemished.
Qatar has what they have done, and what they have done successfully is they try to hide their hand in what they're doing. And it's not just the competition. You mentioned Al, and it's really the Arab quartet. They've got problems with the Saudis, the Egyptians, UAE, and Bahrain. And UAE and Bahrain, we're looking at two countries that recently signed the Abraham Accords. Okay, so they're aligned there. The Saudis, I think they were probably getting pretty close before changes in administration. But the
Mm-hmm.
Qataris, they have been just playing. They say we're resolved on the piracy issues and stuff like that, but you look at what comes out of these agreements, and I'll read what what they'll say, that they're committing in Qatar, and this goes contrary to what is actually happening on the ground. They're committing to contributing to combating extremism and terrorism in all its forms, preventing its financing and the provision of safe houses, safe havens, uh, uh, stopping acts of incitement, hate speech, ensuing in full compliance with the Riyadh agreements. So this is something that they're supposed to be doing. And they are financing Hamas. They are a Muslim Brotherhood nation. So they've been very good at playing this. Well, we're this benevolent actor here, and you know what? We are a good cutout for you in the West to deal with the bad actors, let's say in
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan or other areas, and we'll use you as a backdoor to get to these individuals. And what I'm saying is, no, they're actually a fox in the henhouse. You cannot trust these. You cannot trust them. They are a hidden hand, and I think it's kind of almost like Pakistan. The veil's starting to get lifted off and lifted away from these individuals in these countries that run these countries and their ideology that is driving them. And when you look at the ideology of, and it specifically mentions in this agreement, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qatari government is a hand, is a Muslim Brotherhood government. There's just no way around that. And I don't think they'd have a hard time disagreeing with that. So,
So this is what I don't understand. You have an entity that is colluding with local interests who have agendas of their own. The Premier League has, just wants money. The top six don't want Newcastle to become a competitor to them. Other people want other things. So you have Qatar colluding with these entities. You have the British media start a campaign against the PIF, against the takeover, against Newcastle after the takeover succeeded, because a lot of them simply probably did not believe that it would ever go through and were unpleasantly shocked when it did. So you see literally all these people who had no issues with other Saudi investments, who have no issues with Qatari investments taking place inside United Kingdom as we speak, related to green energy. Uh, they don't call it energy washing the way they call the Newcastle purchase sports washing. They
mhm.
have no problems with anything but the specific Newcastle entity, and this is very clear that it's directly parallel to Qatar's talking points agenda that you can observe through the mouthpieces, including British ones based in Doha. So the question is, you have clear violations of law. You have foreign agents that are messing with the British economy. There's nothing. I'm going to put it bluntly. What is the United Kingdom's government position on this sort of interference with the media, with corporations, with private business contracts, with the economic relationships?
I do believe that the UK is starting to pay some more attention to this. There was just some recent headlines with Crispin Blunt and another MP in the UK accepting money for doing. I also think that you also need to look north to the Scottish National Party as far as their Qatari funding. But the way that I am able to look at this is Qatar does have tremendous leverage over the Premier League, just with the money that they contribute, that we know that's on the books. How much money do they is man, I can't say with certainty, but we know that Manchester United reached out to PIF for funding. They needed money. Okay, we know Spurs actually did the same. These are big six clubs. So are they somehow taking money from Qatar? But Qatar has a lot of money to end up throwing around, and they've used it. The early years, what they ended up doing was they did a lot through. They tried as they built up their broadcast and their TV brand and everything. What they did was they were. You look at Barcelona uniforms; they were the signature. They were the sponsor on their kit. So uh, they have been throwing money around. If you look at, I mean, if you just look at the BN Media Group in the football arena, and I'm not just talking the Premier League, what they have control over with this is they've got control over all European competitions. I mean, all right, in MENA, okay, Middle East, North Africa, English, Arabic, as well as French. They've got the UEFA Champions League. This is big money stuff here. All right, and of course, England
And
sends
how
four
much
teams
money
to
do
the champ.
how much money financially are we talking about? All of this is worth just to get our American audience an idea, because most of them pay zero attention to European sports.
I don't have the financial dollars on being sports right now, but they hold the single largest sports folio in the entire into in out rights out of all global broadcasts. They are the largest
That's
holder. They also control. They hold. I mean, people may not be aware of this, but being Media Group, they control Miramax. They own Miramax, the Hollywood producing film. So you look up new films such as one that was recently done, let's say by Guy Ritchie, called The Gentleman with Matthew McConaughey. That's a BN media. That's a BN film. It says it
well, I
right
did
there.
see the film and enjoyed it, but maybe maybe I would have taken a pass had I known.
Yes, it's a good film, but that part rubbed me a little wrong at the beginning there. But they have
Yeah.
enormous amount of leverage that they've just thrown it around, and they've thrown it around in the right places, and they've done it in the areas of media. And you know that when you control the media, then you can control information. All right. And they know ways to put out that information, and they know ways to control that information and hide it and make sure that it gets out, put out surreptitiously through different cutouts so that it doesn't look like it's coming from them.
So this is what we're seeing with this media campaign and with these parliamentarians who all of a sudden started coming out with strange statements about Saudi human rights record when they had no previous history of being concerned with that or any other issue related to that, and saying not a word about Qatar and its record. And I'm surprised very few people had questions about that until these two individuals got caught. Now, you mentioned a third one. You mentioned the Scottish political party. There was, I believe, another of the MPs with ties to an entity, a business entity that's connected to Qatar and which had been urged in the past publicly in the media to withdraw from Qatar over conflicts of interest and over other matters. This individual, uh, John Nicholson, refused to answer questions about whether he had any private benefit from Qatar precisely, perhaps for that reason. Now, you've indicated in the past that he may have traveled to Qatar for some purpose. He denied it when I asked him for to respond to that. But where is that coming from? Where are those rumors that he had actually been to Qatar coming from?
Well, I think the large part of the rumors are it's tied down to this. He's part of the Scottish National Party, and they're a
Mm-hmm,
secessionist party. They want to break away
mm-hmm.
from England, and what they want to do is they're anti-Brexit, and they want to rejoin the European Union. All right, they know that Scotland. They should know, just as the people in Quebec, whenever they vote against breaking away from Canada, uh, they know that, listen, it's not economically viable. London is the financial capital of Europe. And to make that move would be really cutting off your nose to spite your face. So, what they've done was you need to make up that money somewhere. You need to be able to somehow provide public works, civic works for the population. there was backroom dealings about $1.3 billion deal with the Scottish National Party with
And
the
Qatar.
Qataris. Yes. So that was for building hospitals. That's for working on roads. That's for building schools. That's for all these different things. And it was money that it's buying political influence into the Scottish National Party. Now, if John Nicholson isn't involved, he's not involved. But listen, that whole party, and they are coming under increasing scrutiny in Scotland, they're not happy with them because they see this conflict in interest. They in Doha, they actually had a Scotland Day where people were dressed up in kilts and going around in their own little area in Scotland. So they have been actively courting Scotland and the SNP, the Scottish National Party. And
So is it
BN
possible?
also owns,
Mhm.
they also own the right. And now the Scottish Premier League is not what it once was. Okay. It's not even, it's not even, it's a shadow of its former self. In any
Mhm.
event, BN, they own the broadcasting rights to Southeast Asia and most importantly to Australia. All right. So that Australia, you still have a lot of people that will follow Glasgow Rangers, Glasgow Celtic, Aberdeen, whoever it may be. But Celtic and Rangers being the large clubs, BN Sports owns that contract and that. So there's, this conflict of interest all over. And the name that keeps on coming up is Qatar, 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 Qatar. I don't see Saudi
So,
Arabia. I see Saudi Arabia trying to come in, buy a club, and every roadblock is put in the way in front of them.
it's funny that you mentioned the Scottish national parties because parties, political parties, anywhere in the world, they will have business entities that take care of certain contracts, um, certain public officials, whether directly or indirectly, will be linked to those interests. Parties are good at making money from various projects, boondoggles, and so forth. And party officials visit places that sponsor them. They visit and meet with their funders. How likely is it that someone like Nicholson did not, in fact, meet with Qatari officials somewhere, whether in Qatar or somewhere outside Qatar? That seems to be me very increasingly dubious proposition. And saying that he's never been to Qatar, it's after you mentioned the Scotland date, that seems um, remarkably uh, strange and unlikely.
Yes.
Maybe if he personally hadn't been, his assistant has. Something like that seems very, um,
Yes.
very, very
And at the local
likely,
level,
and
I'll be
more
honest.
likely than
With
not.
Yeah, at the local level, I'll be honest. When it comes to Scottish politics, I'm not the person to speak with. So I
Hmm.
don't know how much sway he has within the Scottish National Party, but I do know that he's made some major gaffes and things that he said. Uh, he all of a sudden started to express this, you know, big. He was one of the original people that was making a big fuss about the Newcastle takeover by PIF. So I gotta think that, you know what, maybe there's a little more there that needs to be uncovered. Uh, in any event, I think the SNP party, I really think they need to be investigated as far as, are they being funded by a foreign government?
That's a very
So
disturbing thought that you have a
yeah, and
country
and
funding
he
a secessionist movement inside the United Kingdom. That's shocking,
yes,
actually.
and Nicholson, he had the audacity to go out and speak out about human rights, and I mentioned this in my article that listen, they're using state-sponsored. You have a systemic state-sponsored slavery system in place between North Korea and Qatar to make sure that country is up and running. Now, I finally looked
By
up
the
the
way,
deaths
I
on
don't
this,
think
and
most
they're not.
people. Mhm.
No,
I don't
most
think most
no
people
no one
know
knows
about that.
this.
If you could
No, it shocked people.
describe this part a little bit more. You did a great job in the article. If you could just uh, focus a little bit more for the audience, because this is kind of a shocking revelation. Most people are not aware of it, and if you could describe that
Sure.
relationship, what is the nature of that arrangement?
The nature of the relationship is basically North Koreans, they ship in their workers. Now these are North Korea. It's hard to see inside there and know what's actually going on. But you have concentration camps. And these camps that are dotted out all over the country. Then you have the elite staff, the elitists up at the top, and then you have this everybody that's kind of in between. And there's not a whole lot of people in between, and they're trying to make ends meet if they're lucky at that. Uh, so what they do is they ship men there to work for basically $1 to $2 an hour, and because North Korea can't get his hands on foreign reserves, what they do is they get paid in Qatari money, and that money gets sent back to the North Korean government. So they don't get to keep any of that money. These individuals, the North Koreans, basically get fed and they work. And I don't know how many have died, but 6,005 people they've estimated have died from building,
By the way, what
getting this World Cup ready for Qatar.
and I'll get to the World Cup in a moment, but what you're describing to
Yeah.
me sounds remarkably similar to what the communist Cuban regime had done with the doctors inside,
Oh,
that had been allocated to various countries, including, by the way, Qatar as well. It's an infamous story about Qatar using these slave doctors from Cuba uh, in a very similar arrangement.
absolutely. And that's why I say they have to stop being looked as being this benign actor that can be used as a cutout to work with rogue regimes when they're actually working with the rogue regimes. They're working with the Islamic Republic of Iran. What extent they're working with the Taliban? They said they're gonna, combat terrorism and everything, but you know what? When the Taliban wanted to set up an office, where did they send it up? They sent it up in Doha. So
Now, it's very interesting that the two human rights issues that these people focused on were Khashoggi and Yemen, because, believe it or not, Qatar appears to have ties to both of them. Khashoggi, upon coming to the United States, became a columnist for the Washington Post, and infamously, after his death, Washington Post admitted that the Qatar Foundation International sent in a former American diplomat who would provide him with stories which he cut and paste from the original talking points, and that his editor would translate to English and publish as under his own name. So he was essentially a foreign agent of another country, and so was the Washington Post, which no doubt agreed to that arrangement just for some benefit. Nobody would go to some unethical deception of that sort for free. I have no doubt that they benefited to some in some way from this arrangement, and so we are seeing Khashoggi's direct ties to Qatar, and at the same time we are seeing that in Yemen, Qatar was asked to leave at one point. They were part of the Arab coalition. They were asked to leave after they were found colluding and leaking information to the Iran-backed Houthis, which led to deaths of Arab coalition members. So it's very curious because even the issues, the human rights issues that they attack Saudi Arabia on, are entirely self-serving. They didn't go for to discuss, some issues that was completely not related to the environment in Saudi Arabia. They went only for the issues that were linked to their own interest. And one wants us to question what's the real agenda in bringing those issues up. Do they really expect people to care about these issues so much? Do they even care about human rights in Saudi Arabia, or are they really basically pushing their own agenda against promoting extreme interests? Khashoggi was an extremist. Khashoggi was a Muslim Brotherhood supporter, and he was not a fan of the reforms by the Crown Prince. And I'm wondering whether all these campaigns really are less about human rights than about Qatar's political agenda in causing mass embarrassment for leaders they don't like.
yeah, absolutely. Qatar is aligned with the Islamic Republic, and you can tie in with that if you Yeah, I tried to mention this in my article to a degree that if you look at Qatar, they are the enablers. They are the if you have the Islamic Republic on one hand, you have Qatar, who believes in the extreme ideology that's forwarded by Said Qutb. All right, this political Islam. All right, his version of it, and then you have the Khomeiniist camp pushing Khomeiniism, which is another form of political Islam. But you have these groups both uniting here. And it's dangerous because what has happened is Iran has not been shy about this. They strive for regional hegemony. They want to do this. And it's not about human rights campaign. I also tried to bring this point up in my article is that when this transfer was initially announced and gone through, it had already gone through Congress that we were no longer, they cut off funding to all offensive operations committed by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia cannot take measures inside Yemen to that would be considered defensive to take out Houthis that are setting up a suicide drone to hit an airport or hit a condo or hit whatever it may be. They were no longer allowed to do that. And then at the same time, you have this blockade, and so it becomes well, this blockade is fueling the humanitarian disaster. Well, the blockade is there to keep weapons, one, from coming from the Islamic Republic and getting shipped to the Houthis, and food that gets used as a weapon during these type of conflicts. So you have the siege that's going on in Marb, and with a siege like that, you use food as a weapon. You withhold it from the population. So they use that as an example of Saudi human rights violations. But when you look at the actions and those actions and the reaction from that has been the humanitarian disaster is just accelerated in Yemen. It's accelerated because the Saudis kept the Houthis in check. They actually kept them in check from marching and laying siege to cities, for bringing individuals in and making them child soldiers, to having sex slaves, to basically being your version of ISIS to the south of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia naturally has a right to be concerned. And then they also have a right to be concerned when the United States decide to remove Patriot battery missiles, which are purely defensive, to defend against incoming missiles that are fired against pipelines, economic infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, terrorist acts. These are terrorist acts. And, you can draw a line, and Qatar, they fall into that and they look Qatar is in a good place for Saudi Arabia. For the Islamic Republic, they are positioned within the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. They're sitting there with all the countries such as UAE, Bahrain, the Saudis, Oman, all these countries that want to seem to try and get along, but you have some individuals that want to create a problem, create a vacuum, and when they see a vacuum, they see opportunity to create more chaos. And it really is, you know, if you want to get down to a very ideological level of this, there's nothing more than the Islamic Republic wants than to see the kingdom of Saudi Arabia fall. There's nothing more that individuals of Al Qaeda and the individuals that Mohammed bin Salman has tried to rein in, the radicals, the Al Qaeda members, their number one target. We always think in America that we're their number one target. No, the kingdom is their number one target. They want to take over the kingdom. So he is facing multiple pressures from all sides, from within the country, which he has tried to change. A lot of people don't see this. It gets completely thrown under the carpet with a sensational story about an individual where there's this long drawn out investigation, and then they finally reveal the report that people can actually follow, that it has legs. They keep on putting out little drips and drabs and more of this information, and there's been nobody there to correct the narrative on it.
No, and it's funny because the crown prince would have no benefit from killing Khashoggi or any other dissident. He would have nothing but headaches from doing something like that, and certainly in the manner in which it was done. If you want to get rid of somebody, you get rid of it with no publicity, quietly, in a way that looks like a complete mishap, accident, heart attack, whatever. You don't create a spectacle that is a complete embarrassment and that drags you down. So clearly, to me, the people who benefited the most from Khashoggi's death were Mohammed bin Salman's enemies and not he. That's for sure. We are actually seeing the same pattern with some of the campaigns related to cyber issues on this front. There is an individual called named Kate Stewart. No one has actually seen this person. No one that I know has actually met with her and told me what she looks like. But people have had communications with her, and she's run an account which was gathered a lot of followers in a very short period of time overnight, and that some people connected to the actual Qatar investigation have accused of running bot-like operations. Now, whether or not that is the fact, Newcastle fans don't need a bot-like account supposedly sponsored by Saudi Arabia or anybody else. The Newcastle fans are known to be a very vibrant, very enthusiastic community that has absolutely no problem directly confronting whoever they need to confront and letting them know what they think. They don't need trolls and bots, and certainly not a single account, rather than a whole army of bots to echo their sentiments. They're perfectly capable of doing that themselves. So the question arises, who benefits from claiming that this account is a troll created by Saudi Arabia? Only the enemies of the very same crown prince and only the enemies of the Newcastle takeover benefit from generating fuss around that a single account. And one wonders who in their right mind would only create one account to support an operation as opposed to a whole army. That does not seem plausible to me. It doesn't seem like a good explanation for this phenomenon. And yet, multiple articles focused on this account, on this supposed individual. There's been a back and forth by various bots and trolls accusing uh, everyone who's ever discussed this account of themselves supporting this troll, and the whole thing has spiraled out of control and became quite a distraction. How do you see this whole story?
I think it's just another attempt to muddy up the water. So as you exactly said, Newcastle supporters are a very vociferous crowd, and we're not afraid to make our minds, to speak our minds. This is something you know, people said protest your club, do this. We have been protesting. We've been protesting for so many years. There's been protests that have been called off because Mike Ashley cynically said that he was going to put the club up for sale. So they called off the protests, but then we pulled the protests back up. It's been continuous. And to think that, I was communicating with somebody in Saudi Arabia that I was talking to, and they said, I asked him if he was a Newcastle fan and a supporter, and he said, no, I'm not, I wasn't, but I am now. So, I was absolutely ecstatic by that, but it shows that Newcastle supporters we live and die for the club. It's, as I said, it is we it's in Northeast. I told you it's an area where all the clubs, all our local rivals, they were called derbies, such as the Tyne Weir Derby, which is against Sunderland. Sunderland's in the third tier of English football. Or you have the Tyne Tees Derby against Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough's in the lower divisions as well. Bolton, Blackburn, all these clubs, they're all absolutely gone. And Newcastle is, I put it, it's a cathedral up on the hill. If you ever go to Newcastle, it sits up there, and it's just it sits over the city, and it's an unbelievable insight. And to go to the game, it's just, and to even just watch them on TV, I just urge someone, if you're watching this weekend, just throw on a Newcastle game. Actually, I think they're playing at Arsenal. Don't throw it on. But in any event, next home game, throw it on and watch the passion within that crowd. And also watch that all they want is a strong effort. If we have a team out there that's working hard, giving it their all, putting in their graft, putting in their shift, they're going to have your support. And that's all they've ever wanted. And they just felt as though they haven't had an owner that's done that for 14 years. They have an owner that's willing to do that now. They've got players out on the pitch that look like they want to work for Eddie Howe and put in that graft and put in that work. And they don't need some bot such as Kate Stewart starting this to basically muddy the waters and create this side thing that just becomes noise in the background. And it's funny because I looked at one of my favorite individuals, and I know you enjoy him as well, Marco and Jones, who teaches
Uh,
at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, which he's getting paid by the government. All right, he's a Welsh expat who lived in Bahrain. All right, so immediately I'm thinking, well, yeah, I see his interest there. He's all about mobilizing the Shia militia, the Shia minority against the kingdom there. In any event, the project that he worked on, or he was actually proud of, he says he specializes in disinformation propaganda and the weaponization of social media, platform liability, social media, and its impact on news outlets. So he's actually researching that. I think he actually wrote the book on that. It looks like Newcastle is a case study for what he actually just did, or if he's implicated. He's got to be. I mean, and he can say that he's got local ties because he went to Durham University, but he's not from Durham. He's not from Northumberland. He's not from the Northeast. He's just a shill for the Qatari government. That's all he is. And he's paid by the Qatari government. So, conflict of interest, once again. There's always a
and he's
conflict of
worked in
interest.
he's worked in Newcastle as well prior to all of these events, which I personally found a very interesting coincidence. Out of all the
Yeah,
places in England,
it's upsetting to me that he went to Durham in the first place because that's where my father went to university. My father went to Durham University, King's College, and then eventually was broken apart, and now it's Newcastle University. It's part that's it's one of the oldest universities in the United States and one of the top three. It's like your Princeton. You got your Oxford, you got your Cambridge, and you got your Durham. And he went to Durham, and that's it's a beautiful college, and it's in the Northeast. That's where he got his PhD. Um, you know, he's a paid agent as far as I say it. As much he may lecture at this university, but he's on the government's payroll, the state government's payroll. So, and the British
so
government paid for his education. The British government paid for his education, and now he's working for the Qataris pushing propaganda.
so having some people like that involved in all these issues in the United Kingdom, don't you think creating this sort of campaigns and interfering on another country's dime, don't you think that creates a conflict of interest and creates a problem of credibility for sourcing this sort of information and
It
discredits the
does,
human rights field as a whole? Actually,
it does, but it comes back to this whataboutism. You bring up this, and all of a sudden it becomes a study of obfuscation. You mentioned about Qatar using North Korean slave labor. Well, what about Khashoggi? Okay, how about Qatar using a CIA agent retired to spy for FIFA to spy on FIFA to gain a World Cup? Well, what about Khashoggi? Well, let's look at Qatar's human rights record. And what about? Let's look at the Islamic Republic. Well, let's look at the Yemen and what the Houthis are doing and how Qatar's enabling that. Well, let's look at Khashoggi. It always comes back to Khashoggi, Khashoggi, Khashoggi,
well, it sounds
Khashoggi.
like Khashoggi seems is more important than everything else going on in the world, than thousands of journalists who died, um, or who've been imprisoned around the world, and it certainly sounds like he's more important than the millions of people suffering in Yemen, and the millions suffering in Qatar, and the millions who have suffered from Islamist ideology. that Khashoggi defended, and it sounds to me that this whataboutism only really concerns people who are paid to promote this tribe. Because if you ask a normal, average person who hasn't been paid by somebody and ask them to weigh in rational about that, they will not defend, a targeted assassination of anybody for any reason, but they will also not claim that this is a more important issue than anything else that's going on around the world, and
Yeah.
they will
And if you
certainly
want to go about
not make this
and
more
my argument
relevancy.
is, yeah, my argument is if you want to go about the moral relativism part about knocking off journalists, okay, let's look at the abduction of Zam. All right, he was lured to Iraq by the Islamic Republic using a honeypot. He was taken up to Iran, up to the Islamic Republic, and executed. All right, so let's look at that example. Let's look at the example. His name escapes my mind. He was found dead in southern Lebanon just in the past year. Why don't we look at that? We know Hezbollah had something to do with it, but why don't we look at that? How many people has Putin had? How many journalists die a year in Russia?
And by the way,
Why aren't we discussing that?
I don't see campaigns going on for Litvinenko or Politkovskaya or some of the other well-known Russian investigative journals who exposed Putin's crimes in Chechnya and various other areas. I'm surprised that the very Mark Owen Jones you mentioned never mentions those names and never comes down on the Putin regime, nor has he made his life's mission getting rid of someone who is in fact a quote unquote former KGB officer with ties to criminal organizations, organized crime. That is somehow not the focus of the discussion. The focus is only Khashoggi, the only guy who matters, and the only who was in fact an agent of Qatar himself and
Yeah.
a promoter of extreme ideology.
Yeah, and even broader human rights, you look at Chinese ownership. There are some Wolverhampton Wanderers is completely owned by Chinese nationals. Now, these are individuals that are part of the Chinese Communist Party and part of the government. What are they doing to the Uyghur population? They're ethnically cleansing it. You also have Chinese ownership in Southampton as well. Why isn't that being examined? Why isn't Abramovich being examined at Chelsea if he's a Russian oligarch? It's if you, it's if you want to have an open discussion about this, let's have an open discussion. But just don't keep on bringing it back to one point. Let's talk about actual human rights instead of individual rights here. Let's talk about big picture
Well,
stuff
uh,
instead of one
I,
individual.
I'm going to I'm going to posit that maybe it's not about human rights at all, because Khashoggi himself was not a proponent of human rights. He was a government censor. He was a former intelligence officer, and we know what types of people he served and what intelligence has been implicated in under those guys. They were not reformers. They were not anybody looking for anything good. And quite frankly, if I had to look at anybody, having people like that plus Qatari interests trying to get rid of someone like him to cover up their own tracks and to frame someone who opposed this whole bunch connected to 9/11, connected to Osama bin Laden, that would not surprise me at all. And, the only thing surprising me is that no one in the so-called, hallowed media has bothered even trying to dig in that direction. So next time any of these British media commentators raises that point, I'd ask them about that, because
Yeah,
if they're
it,
so
it,
concerned about human rights and Khashoggi stealing, maybe they should be looking for who actually had an interest to kill him and why.
yeah.
But bringing,
I
Mhm.
personally don't think a lot of people realize that you know this is the House of Salman. Not the House of Saud. This is a complete changing of the guards, and this was a move towards liberalizing and trying to kind of put some of that toothpaste back in the bottle. So you have this liberalizing MBS who's being painted as a tyrant versus the old guard who's painting him as a tyrant, but they're the actual tyrants. So
Exactly.
it's a still, yeah.
These are, who are we actually defending here? What do we want to see back? The people who who were spreading the extremist ideology all over the world? the people who had the connections to, who were who were covering up for the very terrorists that, that Khashoggi was friends with. I mean, it seems perplexing to me how warped our conception of human rights has become. It became the field has been completely hijacked by extremists and anti-human rights activists to promote completely absurd outcomes that serve no one except for the corrupt. Speaking
Well,
of
you're a
corruption, though,
human rights lawyer. You're a human rights lawyer. You know better than anybody.
I've myself came into this field actually. My very first case that I've ever really looked at was in Saudi Arabia, and my very first case that I've ever had an interest with involved the very individuals who are connected to that old guard. And quite frankly, um, having spent some time in this area since then, I've discovered that a lot of the times nothing is what it appears to be. Information is being misused. Human rights activists focused on Saudi Arabia ignore the real culprits. The capitalists and the fact that an average person doesn't speak Arabic, doesn't understand Saudi law, doesn't go doing independent research, and they'll print anything without anyone verifying or trying to, or even being able to verify the information. There's no doubt issues that need to be confronted and worked on in Saudi Arabia, just like in other countries. But creating some sort of a stigma of even dealing with Saudis is anti-human rights. It creates the opposite result, creating a stigma when somebody is making an effort, and instead of trying to help them and lend expertise, you're hounding them and bringing back the people who can only make it worse. That doesn't make any sense on any level for anybody really concerned about human rights. So when you are talking about these British media personalities and parliamentarians and lobbyists and whoever else is involved in these campaigns, you need to ask them, what do they really care about? If they care about human rights so much, what have they actually done to promote them, and what are the results they expect from their campaigns? Who do they expect to serve? Do they expect to improve the lives of Saudis? Do they expect to improve the lives of the British? Do they really think that will bring the Saudis and the British citizens closer together and help solve any issues? Or are they trying to shut down an avenue of reform simply because they're paid to do so? That's the question that I would ask them, because as a human rights lawyer, because I work on this every day and I've seen tremendous suffering around the world, and I don't. It's the last thing that I would want to promote. But the way these guys going about it, it's bound to backfire and bring back only the worst personalities to the surface. And speaking of corruption that is served by organized witch hunts of this sort, and this is not nothing sort of a witch hunt. I did want to mention, go back to the very issue you keep mentioning, Qatar's use of this former CIA apparatchik uh, to spy on FIFA for its own economic and PR advantage. If you're talking about sports watching, there's nothing like sports watching more exemplifying sports watching than bringing a game completely unfit for the local conditions and the local sports quality uh, at the cost of human lives. There's nothing worse than that. And now we find out from today's report that they employed former intelligence officers to engage in gathering and around this situation. We are talking about turning sports and into an intelligence area. Could you tell us where you think that is heading, and what can be said about former intelligence officials employed to that purpose?
Well, I think it's further vindication that Qatar shouldn't be holding this World Cup to begin with. It's it shows you the length that they will go to pull in somebody that was a former member of the CIA to spy on FIFA during this entire process. I think actually says a lot. And also, if they're willing to go to those lengths to spy about a World Cup, what's to stop them from spying on meetings that are taking place with the English Premier League? in the Newcastle takeover? What's to stop them from spying on conversations that are involving their club with PSG? What's to stop them from? So they're obviously willing to go to extraordinary, and I think you continue to pale, every day it seems like, and I'm glad this is happening, is that there's stories, and maybe it's because we're getting closer and closer to the World Cup. But as we get closer, there's more and more stories that are coming back. As you peel back that Qatar onion, is that wow, there's a lot of bad stuff going on here that they are involved with, and
So maybe these human rights activists should ask the questions: why aren't they concerned with FIFA fixing with the human rights abuses connected to this championship? And by the way, for the Americans who just assume, okay, FIFA is corrupt, there's money in sports, it's always going to be corrupt. What's to stop Qatar from doing this in baseball, in American football, with basketball, or any other sports in the United States? What's to stop them from continuing in this direction here and creating mayhem through team ownership? In fact, I believe a few years ago that's exactly what they tried to do here. There was a scandal involving a sports, I believe, a basketball sort of situation, and also some deals with Ice Cube and other celebrities that went south
yeah,
that they tried to do.
yeah.
So what's
What I think they'll try to do is continue to build their portfolio through like Formula One racing, tennis, other sports. It's going to be difficult to penetrate the American sports market. When it comes to football, that's going to be an impossibility for them. Baseball, Major League Baseball's got it's got really strict rules. Hockey, it's just not profitable. I can't see them doing that.
Mhm.
But God knows, who knows? Um, but they, you know, the people should be asking themselves if they are concerned about human rights, then they should focus. Okay, well, we've got the 2022 Qatar World Cup coming up here. Let's look at the 6,500 people who have died from working
That you
on
know of.
stadiums from that we know of, that have been reported, and we always know you can usually double that number. Okay, let's look at North Korean slave labor being used. Let's look at their pay for slave program that was tied to the Qatar Foundation, where they're paying Hamas money to martyred families. And let's look at those things. Those are human rights issues. If you want to do that, let's have an open conversation about human rights. And let's also look at what Saudi Arabia, if you want to compare those two countries, if that's the argument here that we're going to have, and it shouldn't be that argument, but if you want to have that argument, let's compare those two countries. But at the end of the day, I just continue to look at this is that the intent from the Saudi government, people, the term you mentioned, sports washing. This is sports washing. It's not. This is not them sports washing. This is seeing an opportunity. This is them looking to diversify. Sports washing is buying PSG. Buying PSG and then buying basically your Champions League trophy with the team you're able to put together, and then losing the
Mhm.
league, being so embarrassed by losing the league that you buy every single player on the planet that you can possibly put on the pitch. That's what PSG did after the World Cup. So they bought the Italian goalkeeper. They bought everybody. That's sports washing. And then with the Super League, we haven't even discussed that. I don't even know what you know. I'm sure they're involved with television contracts with the Super League as well. You got to imagine they were. And the Super League, that was a league that was going to be created, and there was a believe me, the English public was in an outcry. The German public was in an outcry because it was going to break federal laws in Germany as far as football ownership and the ownership of clubs and what have you. But it was to get clubs out of debt. It was to get Barcelona out of debt, and that's why you see Messi going on a free transfer to PSG. It was to get clubs like Juventus out of debt. It was to get clubs like Manchester United out of debt. People have been protesting against the Glazer family in Manchester United for years. and it's about debt. So, sports washing, it's PSG. Look at them. Look what they did there, and what Qatar did with them. And then all the television contracts. I mean, if you read through the television contracts that they have, it's just unbelievable. Al Jazeera, they have the regional broadcast for the last World Cup as well as the upcoming World Cup. All right. They have the European competition, meaning the Euros, which were just held last year, where Italy, unfortunately, for me, beat England. Uh, UEFA Champions League, which is held on a yearly basis. So they've got control of all of those. And then as far as I have not looked into it yet, but there's the Europa League, which sits right below the Champions League. So I'm sure they broadcast into those areas as well. If I'm wrong on that, I'm sorry, but I'd be surprised if they weren't broadcasting Europa League matches to the Middle East.
It's funny that you mentioned Paris Saint-Germain because, first of all, there's apparently been a tie-in between them and the French elections because Macron did an obviously political fundraiser with the Paris Saint-Germain hospital in the game. He was involved in some way. The other issue is that there was recently a real article by a journalist, Melina, who discussed the various ethical violations by the club that are not being widely discussed at all, or that people are willing to overlook just because it's so financially profitable. So this is also coming up to the wider issues of the way football and sports have been hijacked by these political interests, and people are willing to overlook what they have a stake in, and they're piling on Newcastle, and when it hasn't even gotten off the ground, really, which I find
And
amazing. It's like they don't care
I
about
think
the
they also
human beings
maybe,
involved.
yeah, and part of me thinks that maybe the Qataris are, because it was floated out there that the Saudis were saying, listen, this was when the initial bid went in, they were in the middle of negotiating for another television contract. And Saudis were saying, okay, you have the problem with piracy. What are the Qataris going to pay? We'll pay you 100 million more. So we'll do that if that's going to be the issue. That never became it. They solved the whole issue with that. But I do believe that they are concerned that at some point Saudi Arabia will, there will be the Premier League will open bidding and open the bidding to other places just outside of beIN Sports,
Hmm.
to other areas that want to broadcast into the Middle East. But I also see that beIN Sports has been taking a little bit of a hit in some other countries as well. The Spanish La Liga, they have renegotiated their contract, and that's going to hurt them financially. The French Liga, they want to renegotiate as well. So this may be them kind of putting a stake in the ground and saying we are losing battles here left and right. We can't lose this one. But again, this battle started a long time ago. I think this battle started well before the initial bid was. I gotta think that that the PIF, Public Investment Fund, Stavely, and the Reuben brothers had done their due diligence and knew that these things were going to come up, and that they were willing to address them, and that they would expect this just to go right through, which it obviously did not.
So we are seeing a lot of these corrupt issues coming to the fore at around the same time. And um, it seems to me that the time of reckoning is coming because we can't have every day some new revelation about corruption come up and regular people not starting to take notice. It doesn't matter how many publications the Qataris buy. At the end of the day, when you have these people getting arrested for corruption and all these Qatari agents issue the same identical talking points about how none of this really matters because the money involved was so minuscule and because it was all for the good cause of human rights. When you have them whitewashing the the fiasco related to the FIFA stadiums and laborers in Qatar by claiming without evidence that Qatar quickly fixed all these issues after the human rights reports came out. this is laughable. I mean,
Yeah.
people
And
have
they
to start
continue
to
to
wonder.
fund terrorist organizations, Hamas, they continue to fund them. They weren't involved with working with Hezbollah before, but now with their working with the Islamic Republic, now all of a sudden I'm starting to see reports that there's going to be some type of involvement with Qatar and Doha working with Beirut. And when you work with Beirut, you're working with Hezbollah. So, it
My
doesn't
issue,
get
of
any
course,
better. They're doubling down here.
my issue here is not that there's criticism against Saudi Arabia or Qatar or whoever. I think these issues are all subject to discussion, and if people are genuinely concerned about human rights, they should certainly do their due diligence and engage to whatever extent they can and provide what they can to help the situation. But my concern is that different entities and countries are being held to different standards for completely politicized reasons, self-serving reasons that have nothing to do with the well-beings of the local populations there, that have
Yep.
nothing, without any input from the local populations there other than politicized activists and so-called opposition movements. There's no engagement with the average Saudis living in Saudi Arabia about their concerns and their interests and what they want to see from their country and their government. There's no real discussion about any of that. None of it is really beneficial, and these standards, the goalposts change every day, and nothing is ever good enough, and no reform undertaken is ever good enough. And the standards are completely unfair, completely biased, and don't benefit anyone except parties with the most money, power, and influence. Not the average people, not the people trying to change things in a positive way. And this seems to me not the outcome anyone should want, regardless of whether they support this political leader or not. They don't have to like them, and they don't have to live in that country. They don't have to support them. They don't have to praise them, but they have to at least look at the issues fairly and see whether things are generally going in a better direction or not, and whether there's opportunity to engage or not that are being granted to people, and whether the way to approach this is constructive or not. This is definitely not constructive. This is not helping. This is not helping. It creates
Exactly.
divisions. It hurts people. It hurts real people who want to see change in their country, and this is not helping them. This is hurting them.
No, you nailed it, Irina. That's what it comes down to. It's self-serving. It's done out of greed. The people that were going to get hurt, it was not just the people for. It's not just me who would sometime in my lifetime like to see Newcastle win something. It's the people who live in the city of Newcastle. It's for that entire region. They were going to lose. It was going to hurt them. And I'm telling you, if this did not go through, they were going to get dropped this year. And they may still get dropped. And I hope they don't get relegated. But you know what? We've got owners that say that even if we do, we're going to get us bounced back up and we'll be just as strong. So we've got this club, we've got these owners here that are with the city, that support the people of the city, that see the Geordie pride, that see the people of Newcastle, the potential there. And it's a shame that this whole fiasco has been about something that it should have never been about in the first place. It's become about issues that the Premier League should never have been weighing in on. They don't have the intelligence and the capacity to do so. And it shouldn't have been done through a propaganda campaign. If you're going to want to do these type of things, it should have been done in, let's say, open door meetings if you're going to have these things. What they ended up doing was they just, I mean, what the deal eventually fell through is they weren't going to give an answer yes, or they weren't going to give an answer no. What they just decided to do is just let's just play the stalling game. Let's just wait for Newcastle for PIF and for Amanda Stavely just to lose interest. And eventually they said, we're sick of doing this. After 4 months, they said, we're done. We're done with this. And at that point, I thought the worst. I didn't think we would the club would be sold. And if it was, Mike Ashley floated out ideas that he had other sellers lined up, but nobody that had the ability to help build the city of Newcastle that comes with Amanda Stavely, PIF, and the Rubin brothers. And at the end of the day, that always made the most sense. And that was going to help the city, help the Northeast, and help the economy, help the people, provide some joy on the weekends. The last 14 years have been an absolute hell. They ruined every single weekend of mine, pretty much, except for when we pull out a draw against somebody. So it's you know it's a good thing. It's unfortunate that it's become this. It's been a trial by tabloids and trolls
Well, I'm
funded
hoping
by
that the end
Qatar.
of this is coming because, up until this point, I noticed that most of the discussion concerning Newcastle until fairly recently had been relocated to British newspapers and had been very local, and there was no outside scrutiny. There was no fair chance for outsiders to see what's going on, and these trolls were feeding over the fact that nobody else knew or cared, or this issue was just so local. uh, People lost traction. It was a big story when it came out, but after a long time of these litigation processes and tabloid skirmishes, no people outside the country lost interest. And I'm glad that there is finally an opportunity to bring this to a wider forum because these issues are not just isolated. Yes, Newcastle has its own great story to tell, and I'm looking forward to the day where when I can celebrate a victory and watch it in person, perhaps in Newcastle on home turf. But besides that, there is also this larger context of how countries that have no business being involved are going and ruining lives for thousands of people for no reason other than on greed. They're not contributing anything positive. They're not engaging in fair bidding contacts that would benefit the local population. They burn, they employ scorched earth tactics for their own interests and to destroy lives, to destroy leaders, to destroy efforts that go against their own corruption. That's all this is
Yes.
about. This is just basic international corruption that has its tentacles absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, I am a proud dual citizen. I hold, a British passport and an American passport. Uh, it's time that this special relationship, both the Brits as well as the Americans, that they get on the same page about Qatar. This is not who they portray themselves to be. They're very skilled at this. From studying terrorist organizations, I know how groups hold their hand, how they try to, hide their hand, how they try to, the narrative that's spun about a kinder, gentler, whatever. They're very, very crafty, the Qataris, in the way they've gone about this, and they've gone away with it for far, far too long. And I think that, as you said, it's starting to be revealed. It's especially starting to be revealed in the United States. I think this has really started to pick up the campaign in the United States, and thank God it's getting a bigger audience here.
And well, let's not forget that Qatar is under investigation by the U.S. government for funding IRGC. So that will be
Yeah,
once that
yeah.
gets some headway to be interesting what comes out and how they're going to try to justify that. Um,
Just a CIA report gives me hope. Something like all of a sudden that comes out, all of a sudden you just hearing drips. I mean, we've been following this for a little while here now for quite a while, and how much since over the last week, how many stories have been popping up where all of a sudden you're just like, wait a second, this is going way beyond coincidence here.
mhm.
This is a pattern. So
This is a pattern, and it exists not because of somebody's conspiracy to set Qatar up for failure, but because they are involved in all these things. It's just
yeah,
a
I
fact.
know.
There would be no,
Well,
there's no smoke without fire.
No, and that's the defense that is used whenever I criticize the Islamic Republic, or I criticize of Iran, or I criticize the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, or when I criticize Venezuela, the way it's been, I always get attacked the same way. It's the same approach. It's obfuscation and never dealing with the topics.
Oh, of course, you're counter Venezuelan propagandist, or you're Saudi propagandist. But you know what? All right, fine. Call me a propagandist. I don't care.
Yeah.
Go dig through my finances. I have nothing to hide. But here's the question: am I speaking the truth? Do I, is my propaganda completely fake, or does it make sense? That's what every person should ask themselves. And at the end of the
No.
day, I'm not scared of these trolls because I know that every single thing I have is connected to relevant facts and they can't deny it. That's why they get angry.
No, it's yeah. It's not disinformation. It's not misinformation. It's the first time this stuff is being revealed, so people can actually take a look at it. And what you're going to get from the one side is them just lashing out and calling you all sorts of things without dealing with the substance. It
Hmm.
comes with the
That's
territory, and
Yeah,
you and I,
absolutely. That's
we're not
typical.
afraid. We're not afraid of that territory. So
No, I'm actually excited to explore it some more actually. So stay tuned. Stay tuned in the future for some surprises related to all of this. This is just a start, but it's a good start. And I thank you so
it
much
is.
for joining us today, for having these discussions, for having a discussion that hasn't been heard here quite from that angle, and bringing up these global issues and highlighting this, and it needs to be reiterated again and again because it's a big topic that hasn't gotten a lot of publicity yet, but I hope that with time it will be, and I hope that in time the truth will win out, and we'll have a lot more to discuss in the future on this and other issues, I am sure. Thank you
Yeah.
everyone for joining us tonight. Stay tuned for our next program, same time next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. EST, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you and good night.